don't want to talk about world peace in 2100, but what can we do now? If I make an advert, eat vegan, you will not get much response. But if they pass by the vegan food outlet and they see how the food is, oh, this is nice, let me try it. Oh, it's nice. You feel good that if you don't do harm, so let me share it with others, let me also build a support network.
Good morning, Hakeem. How are you?
Yeah, hi, Jamie. Good. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good. Well, it's brilliant to get the chance to talk to you. I feel a little bit guilty for nicking guests from our hen house, but I don't feel that guilty. So I really enjoyed your conversation with them a while back. I think it was 2021, but it's great to have you as a guest on Sentientism. And you've listened to a few of these conversations already, so you know roughly what it's about. I guess we're trying to explore three really deep questions: the questions of what's real and how do we understand the world, the question of what and who matters, the questions of ethics, but then really importantly, how do we try and make a better world in that context? And this sentientism worldview I'm trying to popularize and develop answers the what's real question by saying, let's use evidence and reason and try and engage honestly with reality to understand it as well as we can. It talks about the ethics space and saying, look, every sentient being should matter. Every being that has the capacity to suffer, to flourish, to feel anything at all should matter in our moral thinking. And that leads into some pretty radical implications for how we should change the world for the better too. But I'm talking in these conversations to people who, some of whom quite like that sentientist philosophy and some who disagree. So it'll be interesting to understand your own journey, but how that plays into the work you do now. But before we get onto those questions, how would you best introduce yourself and the work you do, both in the business world and the advocacy world?
Yeah, and thanks for the intro. Really crucial questions. I guess we were talking about how to get to world peace. So my name is Hakeem Jimo, Hakeem first name. Yeah, I have a bicultural background. So my dad is from Nigeria, where I'm actually located. I'm calling in from Lagos, Nigeria. And my mother is German, and that's actually where I was born, grew up in Western Germany, not so far from Hamburg. So, but I'm now in West Africa for over 20 years. So I have actually these two cultural perspectives. Work-wise, I'm a vegan entrepreneur since about 10 years. And also last year, we brought a ProVeg International vegan advocacy to Nigeria. We are the second ProVeg country in Africa. So that is also the advocacy side, and then also the vegan business side.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And you seem like you're doing at least 4 different jobs. So I'm not quite sure how you're managing it, but we can explore that a little bit.
Yeah, just 2. But maybe in addition, so often interesting, I'm 52.
Oh, same as me.
Yeah.
71 baby myself. So.
Okay, great. Same year. And I've been vegan for 10 years now. And before that, I was vegetarian 19 years. I thought that was I reached the Olymp before I realized, hey, there's more in it, but I'm sure you have some questions for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for the intro. Let's start with the first of these big questions, the questions about what's real. And that can cover any range of possible beliefs, but often an interesting place to start with my guests is to discuss how they grew up originally and whether that was more in a sort of supernatural or a religious context with a family and society, or one that was maybe more naturalistic or atheistically minded or scientifically minded, or a mix of the two, and how that side of their thinking has changed through their life so far, if it has changed. So I don't know if you want to wind the clock back and tell us your story about, the natural and the supernatural and religion and so on.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned Germany, so where I was born, and that's also why my English is a bit probably weird. I'm not a native English speaker. German is my first language, and now the Nigerian English kicks in. So I hope your listeners really, that's a good mix,
It's crystal clear for me.
German accent and Nigerian English. So yeah, Germany, definitely not supernatural. I mean, we all have an idea about Germany, very technocratic, especially 70s, 80s, few things have changed, but I grew up in a small town, was born in a small town not far from Hamburg, and then moved in my teens even to a smaller town. I would even say rural area. So it's actually a village from that into a village, 160 people, and we always jokingly said there were more cows than humans. That was maybe my first unwilling connection with the animal world and humans, but it got much more in detail later on. But so growing up in rural Germany, it's really down to earth, I guess. Anywhere in the world, in America, if you're, I wouldn't say I'm a farm boy. I grew up on a farm, but from my grandparents' side, it's more like a handcraft origin.
I guess in the German context, when it comes to religion, Protestantism is quite a default. Was that something that applied to your family as well? Did you grow up Protestant?
Yeah, so Northern Germany, Lutheran, Evangelical, Protestants. But like Germany is, maybe the Western world, I don't want to generalize, but we went to church, if it's high, twice a year, Christmas, especially, maybe Easter, until maybe when you have your confirmation, you have to go to the classes. So we knew that we are Lutheran Evangelical, but it was not a very religious background.
Yeah. And is that something you've kept with you, or has it always been something that sits in the background and hasn't really been that important to your thinking?
Well, that's a jump to where I am now, Africa, completely different ball game, and also very interesting. So obviously the spiritual religious world plays a much bigger role in Africa. I'm in Nigeria, still generalizing, careful, but religion is everywhere here, and I like it. Sometimes I jokingly say, in Africa, I started to pray, because you feel like you don't have that sense of control. Like in the Western world, you feel like you can control everything. If you don't feel like you buy another insurance or something. Here, you realize there are a lot of things you can't control at the end of the day. So religion plays a bigger role here. Christianity, Islam, even natural religions. And yeah, you ask about supernatural things. I'm not very good in it, but we definitely have that here. Sometimes there are some touch points, especially how people think. They won't tell you believe in natural religion or traditional religions. It's a lot of wording, but I understand that a lot of world beliefs are still shaped from that era, the pre-colonial era,
Yeah. And it's an interesting dynamic as well, because obviously there's a rich and ancient history of a variety of different religions that run through Nigerian culture. And then, as you say, you've got a few waves of colonialism that have a massive influence on how things are today. So it leaves an interesting mix in the culture. So let's move on to the second question, which is the question of ethics. And for many people, whether they have a religious worldview or not can shape the way they think about their ethics, because if they have a religious worldview, often ethics comes along with that. You have a religious book, or you have a deity that sets an example, and that defines what you think of as right and wrong and good and bad. People with a more naturalistic way of thinking, like me, who I don't believe there is a God or a supernatural, so I don't have a religious book to turn to, in a way construct our own ethics or come up with ethics on a different basis. So again, it'll be interesting to think about your history. How did you think about good and bad and right and wrong, those sort of concepts growing up as a kid, and how do you think about that stuff now, the sort of deep ethical questions of right and wrong?
Yeah, so I really have these two sides. The growing up in the Western country, in Germany, with all the history of Enlightenment. I even studied philosophy in Germany, so there's this long tradition. And then coming to Africa by choice, I have a journalist background. I moved 20 years ago to West Africa as a journalist, and then seeing a completely different way people see the world, and every day I find myself in situations, this two sides, so like I mentioned, in Germany, religion was not so much. Of course, I know a lot of ethical background comes from religion, Christianity, but we didn't even read the Bible to that. It's just now. Recently, I signed up for a Bible podcast, interestingly, even from a US Catholic, just to understand really historically what was mentioned there. And I never had a clue. I mean, you grew up thinking you're a Christian, basically, basically highest was the New Testament, we didn't really look much into the Old Testament, and there were so many references also towards the treatment of animals, Then Nigeria, completely different ball game, religion is much more taken almost by the letter, I saw in some of your podcasts that people think, and that's probably also the German way. Yeah, you have to interpret the Bible and not taking it so, it's just a parable. Here, it's to the letter, If you're coming from a Western background, you just shape your belief system, and that's fine with you, you coming into another world where people are handing over authority to another level, And I think since we're talking about sentientism and what does it mean for animals, what we have to try is how do we convince people, It's not just for the sake of sitting on a podcast with Jamie, but how do we actually convince people, and either in advocacy or with products, And I come to realize that's actually where the two worlds come together. We're struggling in a way it's a global phenomenon. How do we convince the rest of the society, whether I'm in Germany or I'm in Nigeria, because it's not that 90% are convinced in Germany or in the US or in the UK. No, it's not. Still a minority. Might be a little bit more percentage, but it's the same thing here. So it's a universal thing. And I always come back to, I see a lot of similarities in human behavior. Sometimes I walk through the streets here. It's funny, even though everybody is black and in Germany everybody is white, I see features very similar, behaviors very similar, even though they are completely different. I mean, school system is different, parenting is different, but I see really the universal parts. And I think that's where things come together. We're trying to change the world and not just a few enlightened people. But I guess I'm diverting, but I think that is what it's all about, to understand how other people think, in other regions of the world.
But in a way, that links beautifully into the second part of the question, which is who matters. Because one of the commonalities between, many different worldviews, whether they're religious, whether they're non-religious, whether they're Protestant, whether they're Catholic or Islamic, is that there's some really common themes around compassion and caring for others, and ideas like the golden rule that you will find in most religious worldviews and non-religious worldviews too. But one of the sad things that you've hinted at that's common to those worldviews too is that quite often that compassion stops with humans, and sometimes even in groups of humans. Sometimes not all humans get to count in these moral systems as well. And I think you and I share this ambition to expand our moral scope so that we, people care about non-human animals too. But what was your personal journey on that front? Again, given you sort of grown up with these two very different cultures, how did you start to think beyond humans and take non-human animal ethics seriously? What was that journey like for you?
Yeah, so growing up in the countryside in Germany, actually a farm, there was my stepfather, a farmer, and very close to the food chain, if you would say so. What they did was neighbors got together, bought a pig, and then I think I even remember the butcher coming to the farm and then doing all this stuff and sharing it among the farmers, and that was one impression I had from my youth. And then there were stories in Germany in the media. I didn't know much about Africa then. So my world was completely in Western Germany, And then there were stories about, today it would be called factory farming. They used nicotine that when you're a teenager, you don't smoke, and then nicotine, that's terrible. And then there were stories that they were using that nicotine to disinfect the chickens, and I was like, something like, this is something wrong here. Then you have the sea, the North Sea. There were problems with the fish, and then at some point the foot and claw disease. There were a lot. Something is wrong. I'm living in the rural side, and it was like there's too much meat, because a pig gives a lot of meat. But from today's perspective, that is the opposite of factory farming. The families come together, share a pig. Not like you're going into a supermarket and buying 24 chicken wings. But it's like, I had no idea. Nobody was talking in rural Germany about sentientism or veganism or even vegetarianism.
So as a child, there were some, moments where maybe you were seeing what happened to the pig and there were some worries bubbling up. How did that develop for you? And at what point did it start to have practical implications in your life?
Yeah, so the journey went on from those first impressions then to university level, which was in Hamburg, and suddenly there was an alternative meal, in the canteen, and then I had a partner also that was vegetarian, actually African American, and with her own background of Native Americans, Cherokee Nation, and they had their own problems with protecting. I mean, I don't know if it's Legion talking now, but that's what I took away from those conversations, that when the white settlers came, they couldn't. There was a break in that symbiosis with the bisons, I guess. I'm not American, and they. Some in that Cherokee nations decided then, okay, then we can't use the animals anymore, So a lot of things came together. And at the end, it was for me very practical. I started traveling to West Africa, where my dad was. And I realized, when I'm on a vegetarian diet, I don't get sick, because food safety is also different. You eat in the streets, like when you're traveling to a developing world, you suddenly eat in the streets, And I just realized I stick to a vegetarian diet. I'm fine. You can send me anywhere. It was very practical. I started my journalism exercises and was moving around, and I wouldn't get sick compared to the years before. You eat some barbecue on the roadside, and then suddenly you end up with a typhoid fever, which I had at some point. I came back with typhoid fever from Nigeria, and then they put me in quarantine in Germany, and that must have come from eating meat, because people don't throw away things. And if meat stays out too much in those tropical weather, it can get contaminated. And if you stick to a vegetarian, vegan diet, legumes and vegetables can't get spoiled to that level. So it was very practical. Oh, this works. Even then in my 20s, I realized I feel good, why? And it was even hectic as a student, You don't want to buy minced meat, put it in a fridge, and then you forget about it because there's action in town, and then you come back 5 days later and that minced meat has turned to something else, So it was very practical reasons. But with the alternative meal, and then the partner was some systematic things. So you start learning, okay, what's the implications, And was about a transition of 1 year, and then I realized, you know what, this is good, makes a lot of sense. Let me become vegetarian. And like I said, I thought that is you have reached the Olymp, and it took me almost 20 years to realize that leaving out dairy is another huge step, But in the 90s, at least in Germany, people were not really talking about veganism, barely vegetarian, And now I realize, goodness, all the dairy industry is completely insane, even worse in terms of health, So it's a long process, but here we are, talking to Jamie now.
And to be honest, it took me about a couple of decades as well. So it's a very similar story in terms of, vegetarian being a step that felt, meaningful, but it was sort of calibrated to how weird society would think you were at that time, and some of the practicalities as well. So yeah, it took me another 20 years to take the step to veganism as well. And you talked about the health aspects there and dietary shift. How strong was ethics, animal ethics, in your thinking? Was that something that came in later, or was it primarily a sort of health and lifestyle choice?
I mean, definitely it came in later. I mean, I mentioned a few stories, snippets of the nicotine story, the foot and claw disease. You realize something is wrong here, and that today we would say this is factory farming. But traditionally, growing up in countryside in Germany, or even my grandparents in a small town, we used to have fish every Friday. Also very. Now I realize, there's some religious background, but you even forgot about it. But there was fish on Friday. There was a bit of a more sophisticated meat on Sundays, and then you eat the leftovers. And this eating meat every day for every meal, it's something that has only come up in the last few decades. Somebody was saying, this is the first and the last generation that eats so much meat. My grandparents' generation was not eating that much meat. In Africa, you can go if you talk to elderly people here or in the villages, they don't eat much meat. It's now with the more availability, which is the factory farming, that suddenly you have chicken wings for lunch. Yeah, people will tell you in Africa here, that Nigeria, that they eat red meat 3 times a year for a big festive, maybe a wedding or so. And now it's becoming a every deal meal. And then you start asking, how come we are eating so much meat? Coming from fish every Friday, Sunday there's meat, and then you eat, and now suddenly it's all the time. There has to be some, looking from the supply chain, some implications. And what does that mean for the raw materials, the animals? I don't know why we compartmentalize it, shifting away this thinking, because it's normally so obvious. If I eat chicken wings for every meal, I mean, where are all the chicken wings coming from?
Yeah, there's a chicken involved, right?
Yeah, I mean,
there's a victim there. Yeah,
in the 80s, I never ate chicken wings. It wasn't simply there. So there was a shift in production, in availability, and at some point, it's now just, I don't know. Is it when you're now talking about activism that you really see looking behind the supply chain? I don't know at what point it was that I realized there's the ethical problem. My personal view is, if we would come back to the old days, maybe the generation before, where meat was consumed on special occasions, that would be a big step forward. I live in Africa now. I have to be pragmatic, because I want to see results, and at ProVeg, we want to see results. We don't want to talk about world peace in 2100, but what can we do now, and so it's the factory farming that is the problem, and which is a huge ethical problem. I mentioned, maybe stop me again, there's a Green Islam summit coming up. I was invited to in Istanbul next month, and they are thinking about factory farming is forbidden, haram. I'm not a Muslim, but that is much more pragmatic than saying eating animals. We'll get there. Hopefully we get to the 100% leaving animals out. I'm totally with you, but we need to get the big wins now. Pareto, call it 80-20. If we can stop factory farming, we're a big step, and then it will change people's behavior, and then we get to the last 20%.
And this is the last question, I guess, about, how can we make a better world? And there's so many different aspects of that question, as you said, like world peace, poverty, inequality, racism, sexism, homophobia, right? The list goes on. So there's plenty of problems in the human space, but it makes sense for us to focus here, which is, thinking about our treatment and exploitation of non-human animals. And as you say, we might have a utopian end goal, but you've also got to think pragmatically about changes we can drive now. And in a way, in Nigeria, you're in an interesting position because whereas where I am in the UK and maybe a lot of Western Europe and the US, we have a situation where in recent decades, we've gone full down the factory farming, industrialized animal agriculture route. So our approach is to some degree about trying to wind that down and bring it to an end and stop it. Whereas in Nigeria, yes, you've got that problem, but it's as much about preventing the expansion of industrial animal agriculture and factory farming as it is maybe reducing what's there now. So it might be interesting just to lay out a little bit more about the context in Nigeria when it comes to the role and the position of animal agriculture, the role and the position of animal-based foods in the culture, because I think there's a very different problem set you're facing there, and then that will lead us into what you're trying to do in the business and the advocacy world to try and shift things, because it's not a cookie cutter approach where a certain business or a certain style of advocacy in the UK will be that relevant in Nigeria. But I wonder if it's worth laying out a little bit more context. How do people think of animal agriculture in Nigeria generally and the products it creates?
Yeah, very well observed. It's completely different. If you look at the consumption of animal protein here, it's not up to 10% of what is happening in the Western world, especially in America. I got some numbers like where the average African is eating 6 kilograms of chicken in a year. The American is eating 120 kilograms. So it's
mind blowing, isn't it?
So the consumption of animals is actually very low on the African continent. We are in those categories, we are very forward eating,
So in that sense, you're way closer to veganism than any Western industrial country is. Yeah.
And we have to acknowledge that. You mentioned the word prevention. I always say, in Africa, it's not about meat reduction like it has to be in the Western world. The Western world has to reduce meat, but we have to prevent it. I can't talk in my advocacy role, I can't go to African politicians' organization and talk about reduction because we have real malnutrition issues. We have protein deficiency. You need protein to develop, and you can't go into a country where 60% of children have a protein deficiency and say, let's reduce animal products. Then you have to give alternatives. There are alternatives, but you can't just come with a reduction message,
Yeah, it has to be a different path. You're offering a different path.
Yes, we need to address it because as the continent's population is insanely increasing, doubling in the next 20 years, from 1.2 billion people to 2.5 on the continent. We are doubling, imagine UK's population is doubling, it's shrinking probably, we are doubling, and that is the dynamics, even if people eat relatively small amounts of animal protein, just the sheer numbers of increasing it will drive up animal production. We have numbers that animal protein will increase by 300% in the next couple of decades, and that's where I see the global north, global south in the same boat, because the meat producers in the Western world, where they are, they will start shipping it to this place. We have seen it already with tobacco. Once tobacco was out of fashion, they start looking for new markets, so you might still have the same factory farms, but they will ship the meat into new markets, so we have to that's really where the worlds are coming together. But yeah, the message has to be different. The problem is that people know animal protein and they will say, oh, okay, if we're becoming more and I have a little bit more money, let me also eat more, because meat was always a very aspirational thing. Like I said, if you eat meat 3 times a year, it is almost a luxury product. So now suddenly you have more money. Oh, why not? I can eat meat every day. So you have to really change that narrative. Yeah, mostly about health. That is the way forward. You can get people with the health message.
Yeah. And do you think, is there also a cultural appetite to take a different path that you can tap into? Because as you say, the default is population goes up. People see animal products as a luxury product and as a status marker. So as people hopefully get, better off, sadly, the consumption of animal products goes up. But that does lead into a default path, which is just following, frankly, the West into industrial animal agriculture, both domestically produced and sold into Nigeria. Is there a cultural appetite to say, look, maybe we should, and we could take a different path where instead of, following Western cultures into animal agriculture and into factory farming, we could set out on a healthier, more ethical, innovative path where Nigeria can do its own thing? Does that have any resonance as well? Or is it primarily a practical thing about health choices and availability of products?
Yeah, it sounds a bit more like wishful thinking,
Yeah, I do a lot of that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think the fact is that the Western culture has been so powerful in transporting that material, desire, not only Africa, everywhere, It's maybe a little bit like cars, a couple of decades ago, people were wondering, if all the Chinese start driving cars, how is the world going to handle that, And it's true, a lot of these developing countries want to catch up in terms of material wealth, which includes, unfortunately, also meat. Want to drive a car, they want to eat meat, they want to have luxury products, because we see that in the different media,
Yeah, it's the model that's just been set. Yeah, the aspirational model, yeah.
And it's hard to tell people that have never experienced it, come with a moderation message now. The Western world is, it's a bit over the top, so you guys don't make that mistake. It doesn't work like that, well, we haven't even started. Let's also enjoy it, So we have to really come up with new ideas. For me, in terms of talking a lot about food, there are other advocacy things, well-being of animals. I believe very much in the food sector. For me, it's like, if people don't eat meat, we'll save animals. It's as simple as that.
It's pretty straightforward. And it would be brilliant to know your story, because I guess that's half of your life now is entrepreneurship and running a business. You've made a very practical intervention in that space. I don't know if you want to tell that story about, what you've been doing over the last 10 years and where you've got to.
We also have wild animals. I could have done protection of wild animals, which is super important. That's more biodiversity, but I actually put my work into not preventing factory farming. There's more to it. I really believe that going down that road will ultimately damage society. If you kill animals, what goes around comes around, maybe in that spiritual way,
Yeah, there's like a karma.
Yeah.
Which I think also works just in terms of psychology too, right? Even if you don't believe in a spiritual world or karma, I think that it can do psychological damage to people, causing harm to others. So yeah.
And it's universal. I think it's, you look at children. That's why I always come back to we are wired in the same way, whether you grew up in the US or in Liberia, let children play with animals, and then chickens, and then take that chicken and say, you want to cook it this weekend. Every human child will react the same way, So we are losing something growing up, like, what is it? I believe that if we want to advance human societies, and there's a lot of injustice in the world, we can talk about that also, even in the Western world. I just saw a documentary from John Lewis, an African American growing up in non-privileged neighborhoods, called "They're Trying to Kill Us." It seems like there's a method behind it. You don't have access to good food. Your whole society changes. The way you treat each other. So that is very important for. Non-whites are the global majority. In America, it's the minority. But coming from people of color, we have to really think about how can we get better societies without copying the Western world, because that also leads, for me, it's clear now, I think to everybody, it has its own problems, environmental issues, and also the social fabric about societies. For me, the big motivator is actually a better society, and that starts with how you treat others, how you treat yourself, and also it includes, for me, that is, I guess, the sentientism in it. It includes animals. It's violence is you probably have experts that can make the connection between violent behavior. I mean, we have those studies that if people would kill the animals to eat them, 80% wouldn't do it. I mean, I see that here every day. People are actually doing it, and it's even here. It's not everybody that does it, but it's when you have all these religious festivals, and then people are bringing their cows and even camels, in Lagos, and then the next day you're driving through, and the streets are literally in blood. I mean, if that would happen in the US, in New York City, blood streams flowing down Fifth Avenue, that would make a lot of people think, rather than if it's a factory farm somewhere in Ohio or something.
Yeah, it's out in the open, right? It's in your face. It's in your advocacy work with ProVeg Nigeria. Like you say, you're addressing some of the education stuff. You're addressing the health questions. You're addressing these sort of links with human society and the nature of our society and our psychology as well. And how much is the environment a factor there too? Because one of the other differences, I guess, in Nigeria is that, how things like climate change and environmental challenges and deforestation and land use and pollution, are those seen as a relevant factor that can help with your agenda as well? Or is that another area where people are saying, we can't focus on that because we have more pressing concerns?
I think the most effective way is talking about health, because, again, human nature is very greedy, and also, again, in the Western world, the same way. It would be very noble to talk about animal rights or environmental rights, but at the end of the day, most people are driven by selfish reasons, Of course, in Africa and other countries, human rights are an issue, a real issue. I mean, the majority of humans still live in authoritarian regimes, not even in the global South only, So you want to approach them with animal rights while they have human rights issues. It's a challenge. But people realize the environmental degradation. They see the climate change. They're connecting the dots. The deforestation we have in Nigeria, the desertification, when the herdsmen, that is the cattle rearers, because traditionally that's where the beef came from. They move where the pastures are green, and that means they're pushing down to the south, and then they clash with crop farmers and horrible massacres,
And that's a really interesting case, because I quite often will talk about how animal agriculture was one of the main drivers of colonialism in the first place. It's why, one of the reasons why colonial powers felt they needed so much land was to grow feed crops and to ranch and to farm animals. But it's also driving conflict today, right? You can see deforestation in South America. You can see the situations in Nigeria. It's driving intra-human conflicts because of a land hunger that's driven by the growth of animal agriculture. So it's not just a historical challenge.
But then the reality is also the people in the urban cities don't really care about the people in the rural cities, because it's always a disconnect in humans.
It's far away.
Yeah. But health is everybody's issue. And people realize, oh, the meat we're eating today that maybe comes from China or Brazil is definitely is not of the same quality, than it was back then. Or the people feel it makes me sick. And that's what we can use in a pragmatic way. We say, hey, you don't need to eat that much meat. There are alternatives. Just try it. You'll feel healthier, and yeah, that is my humble way,
Yeah. Thank you. So in the advocacy space, it sounds like health is the headline and the primary driver. I'm hoping you can still squeeze a bit of, non-human animal ethics in there as well, particularly at younger ages when you're working on education, because I think you're right that young children have that natural compassion that goes beyond the species boundary already. So if we can sort of tap into that and give them a chance of holding on to it. But I completely appreciate that, health is the number one strategic message you're working on.
You need a hook.
Yeah, you've got to have a hook, yeah.
And then the rest will follow,
And it can make space for other aspects and other arguments, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
In the time we've got left, one of the other things you're doing is the business you've been running for, I think, is it 10 years now? It must be your 10-year anniversary for Veggie Victory and the product company around it and so on. It'll be interesting to talk a little bit about how that's worked out, because you're not just doing sort of theoretical advocacy here and talking about a future world. You're actually providing people with alternative products that they can, buy and choose today. So it would be interesting to know what that journey's been like, how your products and your restaurants have been received in Nigeria, and what are your hopes for the role that could play? Do you think it's something where, you'll see competition soon of, others, coming to join you in your mission of vegan food in Lagos and Nigeria?
Someone has to start. So we were the first mover, and it was really a very individual decision. I knew by then, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, that this is working for me health-wise. I also can identify it from my belief system. It's perfect. You feel good that if you don't do harm. So let me share it with others, let me also build a support network that I can have a vegan burger, because nobody was offering me a vegan burger and I was craving a vegan burger, or we have this barbecue delicacy, suya in Nigeria, and I couldn't eat it anymore. And I felt I really would like to eat a vegan suya, so it was very for that reason. And then I said, let's share that, one thing also, you can convince people, again, selfish, if there's some economic incentive in it, and if it becomes, that's the plan, if it becomes an industry, you can employ people. You need to give people economic opportunities to follow you. You can't just come and say, stop eating this, and then you're going away,
Or expect them to pay 2 or 3 times the price for a more ethical product, yeah.
We needed to be very practical, showing here, this is a VChunks. It's a meat substitute that really works the way we cook in Africa, You can make your suya, you can make your stews. I always say we're not a burger land. We don't need burgers here. We need our own local champion meat substitute. So that was really the idea. And we now have 6 food outlets. We employ over 30 people. Is another twist. We thought it was just the product. That's now the plant-based industry. But I think we saw in the last 2 years, we need to work harder, bring people to it. It's not just show people, oh, there's a product, but also carry people along. Again, you need to hook people emotionally. You really need to understand what they want, not just coming with a rational thing. Often our movement is too rational. Look at the numbers for the climate, look at the numbers for the health. We are rational beings, or so we think. We had the Enlightenment period behind us. We all make rational decisions. No, we don't. We have enough evidence that people don't make rational decisions. So we need to then accept it and then understand, okay, how can we still make people choose, which is through very selfish reason, or connecting them emotionally, like not just putting a product on the shelf, but doing cooking events, for example, having food outlets where people can see it, because if I make an advert, eat vegan, you will not get much response. But if they pass by a vegan food outlet and they see how the food is, and that's what we're seeing. Oh, this is nice. Let me try it. Oh, it's nice. You need that hook. We humans are wired like that.
Yeah, absolutely. You need the story and you need the message. Yeah. And in many cases, you're basically veganizing, traditional Nigerian foods that people identify with. And I guess that's part of the story, right? It's easy. It's something they recognize, the smells, the tastes, it all fits. How are you managing on the price front? Because that's one of the challenges in the sort of classic meat alternative space is quite often, they can be 2 or 3 times more expensive. And it's a big ask for people to pay more, or even if the product is more healthy and more ethical. Do you manage, how close to price parity do you manage to get with animal products?
Yeah, we always knew we have to reach immediately price parity and even come under in terms of the volume. It's a different cooking. We have a dehydrated product and then you boil it, it actually gets bigger, So in terms of that volume, you are getting double the value compared to beef, because beef comes frozen, or chicken, frozen from Brazil. And then by the time you boil it, it shrinks. Everybody knows that, you buy a steak and you put it, and then it's only half of the size. So compared to that, you actually get much more. But again, the price factor is not what convinces people. Of course, it needs to taste nice. The price should not put you off, but you need that. We always say people need to try the food. That is when you have that veg prejudice, when you want to have a chance to overcome it. So we knew we have to be cheaper than meat, at least price parity. We have achieved that. And now it's to create awareness by really getting people to try it. And yeah, it's of course, I wish it was faster. It's a lot of things, supply chain,
It's a hard business. It's a hard business generally, yeah.
And how do you supply it from one country to the other side of the country? While the animal agriculture is actually very decentralized, which can be an advantage. So a lot of things come in, but why I'm hopeful is the mindset is there. People are realizing, hey, how come I'm having health issues in my 50s, in my 40s? It's dropping, it's not increasing. How do you develop a country when people are only productive until their 50s, and then have 20 years less productivity than in the Western world? How will you ever catch up, But for really basic selfish reasons, people see, oh, my mother is sick, my uncle is sick. People are talking about, oh, I'm trying to reduce meat, I stopped eating red meat. It has the aspirational, you have to tick a lot of boxes,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's an inspirational story. Thank you. And it's rare to find someone who's both driving a sort of advocacy journey as well as running a major business at the same time. But yeah, it's properly inspirational. You're trying to set out that different, innovative path that hopefully many others will soon follow. So thank you so much. It's been great to talk to you. Is there anything else you want to add into the conversation? But also, how can people best follow you and support the work you're doing?
First of all, thank you, Jamie, for having this platform where you're looking at things holistically. It's also very refreshing because mindset change has to work on different levels. It's not just one product or one intervention that changes it. It has to we need to understand and also exchange from different cultural regions, to really understand what's worked better. In terms of following, ProVeg Nigeria, very easy to find. The company Veggie Victory, Veggie Victory, we are winning, we're winning with the veggies.
I like it. Yeah.
But otherwise, just Google vegan and Nigeria, you will find us, or vegan in Africa. I'm sure you will come across one of our works.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And do you do much social media yourself, or do you leave that to the business and the ProVeg?
We're talking about young people here. 70% of Nigerians are younger than 25. It's all about how do you reach it. Of course, we have help because I'm not anymore 25.
You can still make it on TikTok, I think.
We both should have a show. So people are helping. but I definitely have an eye on that, Veggie Victory NG, NG for Nigeria, and ProVeg NG. Go find us.
Well, Hakeem, thank you so much for being a guest on Sentientism. It's been a real pleasure, and more power to you.
Thank you, Jamie. And then see you soon.
See you soon. Please stay in touch.